Prestige and status is not necessarily a bad thing in our life. And I want to talk about that and hopefully try to convince you or get you to think about prestige and status in a slightly different way. We hear about this a lot, that there is sort of a pecking order or status ranking. A pecking order is, I'm not exactly sure. I probably should look up the origins of it, but basically the basic story is that there is, as you are in a group, there is some people that get more status than others, or some actors that get more status than others, and they get sort of first dibs on anything or access to resources that um, are not necessarily, not everybody gets access to those resources, and in a democratic society, I think that is a, it's often viewed in kind of a negative way, and I'm a very thoughtful when it comes to everybody should get opportunities and get access to opportunities. But how this often arises, at least in my view, is it's a natural process to organize that we do not necessarily intentionally have this to happen. And yet it almost always happens in any social groups, no matter what the particular social groups are. In science, for example, and I think a lot about science, it would be very nice if everybody had access to the same opportunities and were equally weighted, except for sometimes it doesn't necessarily end up that way because there is signals that are given. And stay with me here. I realize that this could be taken in the wrong way, but there's often signals that are given from the levels of education that you get or where you go for your institutions. And there is a lot more to be said. There's lots of information that is that is hidden, that is not necessarily forthright, that is representing those sort of status hierarchies, right? So, for example, you might go to a better school, and that represents somehow that, for many years before that you had studied and you did everything sort of quote unquote right and allowed you to get into that particular institution. That signals something to somebody else. Now, on face value, that makes a lot of sense, except for we often have to take a deeper dive in terms of why that might actually exist in the first place. Right, so I'm deeply aware, in my own upbringing, and then now with my kids, I think about how different that upbringing is compared to what my kids get. We actually sit down. Growing up, this wasn't the thing. I would have to do work on my own. Like nobody would sit down at the table. I would have to go into my room and just kind of work by myself. But in my household, we sit down at a table as a family, and we do homework together. We sort of vastly support our kids, and I think about how unfair that actually is. And I think about, that's somewhat problematic because my kids are getting resources that other kids don't get. Um, and I think about, on one end, that is just, hey, you might say that is being a good parent. And yeah, that might be being a good parent, but that is inherently not fair as a system, right? And this could be said out of a lot of different things. You name the sort of characteristics that you might look at. There's often undiscovered or unobserved information or resources that simply people just don't get. And if we look at only the surface, then we're hiding a lot, and we're not acknowledging that this exists. So, given that there's these kind of status hierarchies that exist and that they do have some information in them, which makes it really challenging. But at the same time, we have to understand why they actually exist. And sometimes, many times, that they have existed because of very unfair circumstances. You name the circumstances that we're all aware of from many years ago that were just unfair, and in fact harmful, and filled with just the wrong intentions. Um, and so what to do? What are we supposed to do? How are we supposed to think about these sort of challenging things? I think we need to take a step back and realize that there is some information there. And that's what makes it challenging. There is some information, but at the same time, think about how you can, um, be empathetic and think about other people, or, really take a deep dive and say, why is it that actually is going on? Is there something else that's going on? Is this an important characteristic that we want to take a deep dive into? I am much more prone to take a very a weighted average, a sort of balanced scorecard approach of looking at all sorts of different things and saying, hey, these things matter. These things that are on the surface, um, they sort of represent something, and they matter, but at the same time that there is some really important characteristics that we need to take account of, because those represent hidden resources that a lot of people don't get. So what I'm suggesting is not necessarily take things at face value. So what I'm suggesting is really just be empathetic. Really take a holistic approach. Really don't just say this is the way that it is and how things should hold up, but say, hey, not everybody gets the same place. They don't start at the same place. We need to consider that and make sense of it and see what it's actually like to be around that individual or around that resource, doesn't matter what it is, and sort of think about it in a much more richer way and be thoughtful. And I think that's what I'm getting at here is, as we start using these symbols and sort of status hierarchies as something that represents something, I think we're going to lose a lot of information. And I think we need to take a step back and start being more empathetic to the people that are behind it. All right, take care and have a wonderful day.